Hello, World History, and welcome to our next lecture. This is finishing up, so this is part 3 of Protestant Reformation. And here we are looking at its consequences. In our previous lecture, we ended talking about how Christianity changed in the Americas, in particular the influence in Central America, particularly within Mexico, and in South America, like along the Andean Mountains, so uh, Chile, Peru, etc., how Christianity and the local religions merged and created a new version of Christianity there. And then you saw at the end of the lecture that we were going to look at Asia, which is what we're going to look at now. In this lecture, we're also going to touch on changes in the other world religions. So this is wrapping up our world religions for this period, this unit, because there are some changes, right? Some reformations, some changes um, in Islam, in Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. So in Asia, Christianity in Asia. So we're going to look at Christianity in Asia, and we're also going to look at Christianity in Africa, and then we're going to look at some of these other world religions. So if we think back to our the experience of Christianity in the Americas, right, brought primarily by the Spanish, that is the vast majority of Christians still in the Americas. If we think of North, Central, and South America, right, they're going to be Catholic. They're going to tie their Christianity roots to Spain. So there's that experience, and now the experience in Asia. So the missionary efforts to spread Christianity in China were less successful than what took place in Spanish America, and this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, China was never conquered by the Spanish or by any other European nation. So unlike in Central and South America, where Spain conquered the entire territory, with the exceptions we noted like Brazil, that didn't happen in China. So China still retained local authority and power through much of the area. China was a strong and powerful independent nation, right? And so it was not easy for a European nation like a Spain to impose Christianity upon the population. And China was never threatened by the Spanish military. Again, their Chinese military was at least equal to and probably superior to Spain at this time. And again, we're talking right now in the 1500s into the early 1600s. Probably wouldn't have been much of a match, a fairly simple victory for China if there had been a military conflict in which China had thrown its full military resources into the conflict. So the experience in China is that Europeans needed the permission of the Chinese authorities to operate in the country. And here we have a picture of a title of a book, A Jesuit in the Forbidden City, right? Matteo Ricci, the most famous missionary to China. He writes this diary, and so we know a lot about his life and his and what it was like in China, right? This is a good peek at China during this time, and it's from a European viewpoint, a Christian European viewpoint. So this is one of these people, Matteo Ricci, who does gain permission to live in China as a Christian, to practice his Christianity. But they needed permission, right? In Spanish America, because Spain defeats the kingdoms, the nations that are there, the government structures that are there, like the Aztecs and the Incas. They are the ones in power, and they can dictate what type of religion is approved and not approved in that area. And of course, they approve Christianity. But that does not happen in China. Remember in last lecture I talked about the Jesuits a little bit, highly educated, and they would educate themselves to become familiar with the culture, and here we have a little bit more on that. So this main strategy that takes place in China is carried out by the Jesuits. And the Jesuits decided that they wanted to target the Chinese elites, the official Chinese elites, right? So they're not going to try to convert the masses. The Jesuits' strategy was to convert the main leaders. Maybe not the emperor himself, but certainly, right, the high ups in government, the elites, the rich, the powerful. And once they're converted, they will then, once they're converted, the idea is they will then turn around and they will lead the masses to Christianity. The Jesuits also downplayed their mission to convert. Conversion was not something that they went in, right, with a big sign and say, convert to Jesus. No, they emphasized their interest in exchanging ideas and learning. They came as scholars open to learning about Chinese, and hopefully, they hoped they would have something to give back to them, right? And it would be this exchange of ideas and learning. And so they go primarily as scholars, not as converting missionaries. They take an interest in Chinese culture. They become familiar with Confucian texts. They learn Chinese. They dress like Chinese scholars, etc. Right? So they're ingraining themselves in Chinese culture, and this is how they actually. This is also how they operated in places like in France, particularly the French Jesuits. They do this with Native Americans in France. They dress, they speak, they eat, they become familiar with the customs and cultures. And that happens across the globe. But here, right in China, it becomes particularly important because they cannot have a European government to rely on to dictate to the Chinese what to do. So they are trying to convert them, to convince them that what they have to say is worth listening to. To help strike this balance, to remain Christian for both themselves and to their superiors who may not fully understand and support their their emergence or the immersion into Chinese culture, they would do some things like define some Chinese culture rituals, like honoring ancestors, as non-religious, and this helps separate the idea that ritual from a religious ritual, which means that the Chinese can keep it, right? Because it's non-religious, and therefore it doesn't have to be removed if they were to become Christian. And also for the Jesuits, it means that they can at least partake in these rituals and not feel that they are being a heretic, that they are denying their Christianity. Once they became familiar with a Chinese culture, and in particular Chinese philosophy, like Confucian philosophy, they would begin to point out the similarities, the parallels between Confucianism and Christianity. And they would try to draw those connections and then slowly work to perhaps convert. But again, conversion was not like their top priority. They were not there to convert. They were there to lead by example, what might be a good way to put it. So that's how the Jesuits operate. Now, some of the outcomes. There are minimal conversions in China, right? Chinese culture is strong. Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and the mix of those already give Chinese society a spiritual fulfillment. They don't see the need to convert to Christianity, right? That appeal that is often strong in Christianity that, right, you are a sinner and it is only Christ and his love and sacrifice, his resurrection that can save you, doesn't really appeal to the Chinese, particularly when the Jesuits use this tactic. And the Chinese not having a strong central deity in their belief system, right? If we go back and remember what Confucianism is about honoring, right, relationships, being in a right relationship, right, with your king, with your teacher, with your father, with everyone, right? It's about those relationships. And of course, there's an element of honoring your ancestors in that. Buddhism, pure Buddhism, there is not a deity, a person-like deity, right? And certainly the version of Buddhism in China doesn't believe in that. Rather, it's about living the right way, the Eightfold Path, right? Gaining insight into life. And Taoism is about balance between nature. So there isn't a deity like God, like we believe in, or Jesus, who is a person type deity, or right in Hinduism, even there are gods, although there are multiple gods there. So this makes it difficult for the Chinese to say, oh, I have to give up. I can't believe in Buddhism. I can't believe in the Eightfold Path if I'm going to become a Christian. That doesn't make sense, particularly when a lot of it seems to be very similar. So why can't I kind of hold on to both? Difficult for the Chinese to accept that, and so that results in not in a low number of conversions. So a lot of work, right? A lot of accepting Chinese culture by the Jesuits, and a lot of learning by the Jesuits and Europeans through their writing, the Jesuit writings back to Europe about what the Chinese know, particularly the science side of things. But as far as conversions, not a great result here. So after 150-ish years or so, right, the Pope and other Catholic officials in Europe decide that the Jesuit strategy is not working. This idea of accommodation is a strategy that isn't working. We need conversions. And so the Pope claims authority over all Chinese Christians. Now, what he means by that is that all Chinese Christians need to follow him. He is their final authority on earth, and so what he says must be obeyed. Otherwise, a Christian, and in this case Chinese Christians, would be disobeying God and therefore in jeopardy of going to hell. Obviously, this is going to be a problem for the Chinese emperor, because now the emperor and the Pope are both claiming ultimate authority over this segment, although it's a small segment of the Chinese population. The Pope also declared sacrifices to Confucius and worship of ancestors to be idol worship, something forbidden to Christians. Remember, we just said that the Jesuits early on decided to separate that reverence of ancestors and not consider it a religious activity, and therefore it's not idol worship. The Pope reverses that decision, and that, of course, makes this very difficult for Chinese Christians. So, in 1751, right, the Emperor Kangxi forbade Europeans to spread Christianity in China. Right, this is happening at about the same time, early 18th century, 1715. This is the Chinese response to this. And so many missionaries were expelled from China, and Chinese Christians were basically persecuted and encouraged to denounce Christianity. So in addition to, right, the Pope claiming ultimate authority over the Chinese Christians, there are some other problems that the Chinese government had with Christian missionaries. They had worked under the Manchu dynasty. They had worked with the uncivilized foreigners, and there's a change in dynasties. And so this is one of, right, during this period between the 1500s and 1715s, there's a change. And so remember, one of the key features of Chinese civilization throughout history is xenophobia, and the idea that foreigners are somehow a problem for China. And so when there's a change in the dynasty, that often is one of the issues that is brought up, is if they worked with any outside foreigners, then they were not truly Chinese, and this was what led to the problems that led to the change in dynasty. So that was a problem. The Chinese never fully, particularly the leadership, never fully understood communion, right? And the Catholic teaching of communion at the time was that when you took the bread and you took the wine, There was a period when the priest was blessing it and saying prayers over it that it turned into the actual body and blood of Christ. And we talked about that at the beginning, 2 lectures in part 1. For the Chinese, this seems like cannibalism. Well, you're eating another human then. And this is a problem, right? Claims of miracles damage their image as men of science, right? So rather than, right, when a Christian would say, "Oh, that was a miracle," we can't explain it, right? The Chinese, who are deeply rooted in science and leading scientists really of the world at this time, they see this as an attack, as a challenge to their understanding of the world through science. They don't like the fact that Christian groups met in secret. And of course, they were doing that for good reasons, to avoid persecution, but they didn't like that. Secret meetings, loyalty to the Pope, cannibals, you can see that this becomes problematic, right? And then lastly, concerned with the fact that Europeans had just conquered nearby Philippines. This leads to some concerns that the Europeans are going to use the Philippines as a base to continue to subvert the authority of the Chinese government in China. So these are other concerns. And so the Chinese decide to ask the Christians to leave and to ban Christianity. All right, moving on to Africa. So Christians, right, unfortunately, are the main participants in the African slave trade. And with that, they bring Christianity to Africa. Here, right, we're going to talk about the type of Christianity that grows up, particularly in the Americas, in African communities. So most of these African communities, as we've already learned, are going to be enslaved people from Africa. And so they bring their ideas and their local practices from Africa to the Americas, where they are introduced to Christianity, either on the coast, on the boat, or once they get to the Americas, right? And in the Americas, it is expected, particularly where most of them go, which is to Spanish America, which is Catholic, they are expected to convert, to be baptized, and to become Christian. And so they bring with them their religious beliefs, their non-Christian religious beliefs, and as we saw with the Native Americans, this forms a new version of Christianity. One important element of this is revelations, right? Or dreams, visions, right? Being shown something, right, of another world. And this becomes an important element of Africanized versions of Christianity, particularly in South America. So a couple examples of this. Another example here actually is from the Caribbean, right? These two examples come to us from the Caribbean. So voodoo in Haiti and Santeria in Cuba are examples of syncretic religions. These are blended religions where strong elements of African religious ideas and customs and rituals are blended with Christianity, and it forms a kind of a new religion, voodoo, Santeria, etc. So similar to what happens among natives, Native Americans, I should say, this happens among the African communities, the enslaved African communities of the Americas. Moving on. This is an era where we have some changes in other religions as well. And so let's take a look at the Islamic world. During this period, from about 1500 to 1750, right, Islam continues to spread. Wandering Muslim holy men, Islamic scholars, Muslim traders. These are the typical ways that had been spreading, or some of the ways that had been spreading in the past. The main difference now is that Islam is not spread by conquering armies or expanding empires like in our previous unit. Now, Islam is going to be spread primarily through missionaries, scholars, traders, these things. As it spreads, it often blends with local religious traditions. So we are seeing here a theme. You should note that there's a theme here that as these religions spread around the world, as these universal religions spread around the world, they often end up becoming blended with local religious traditions, and something new or a new version of the religion emerges in that area. Of course, just like with Christianity, strict Muslims do not like this blend. They see it as as something new and corrupt, right? That it strays too far from Muhammad's original beliefs and the authority of the Quran, and so these are not always seen as acceptable by the strict Muslims. Just like the church didn't always agree with, right, the Christian church, and for our examples, the Roman Catholic Church don't agree, and they don't condone things like the voodooism in Haiti or the Santeria version of Christianity in Cuba, and they kind of went along with because of they went along with it, but begrudgingly, accepting and allowing, like in West Mexico, right, viewing the saints as kind of the old Aztec gods, or playing that same role, and having something like the Virgin of Guadalupe, which of course has nothing to do with original Christianity in Europe. So that's taking place, right? And the Catholic Church, the popes and the leaders of the Catholic Church, not really excited about this, and we see this happening in Islam as well, as a similar event takes place. An example we'll get to a little bit later and talk about a little bit more, but an example of a blended, right, religion, a new religion that is a mix of two religions, one being Islam, is Sikhism in India, which Hinduism and Islam is blended together. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the spread and these new versions of religious of new versions of Islam, right, cause movements of religious renewal and reform in Islam, kind of like it does in Christianity. So this is a period in Islam also of reform, of reformation. So some new versions of Islam emerge, just like some new versions of Christianity emerge, Lutheranism, Calvinism, etc. And there is a counter movement to kind of keep to appease or to keep the religious pure, Islam pure, and so there's a counter movement as well. All right, one of our prime examples of a movement within Islam, a reforming movement within Islam, is Wahhabi Islam. This takes place in the mid 18th century, so this is the mid 1700s in Arabia, right, the birthplace of Islam. And it starts with a scholar, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhabi, who is an Islamic scholar from this area. By the 1700s, right, the Islamic world is experiencing some difficulties. The Europeans have successfully kind of cut much of the Islamic world out of the economic trade as the middlemen, right, through their establishment of colonies in Africa, in Asia, and in the Americas. The Ottoman Empire is weakening, right? It's not going to fall right now. It still has a couple hundred years to survive, but the Ottoman Empire, kind of the crown jewel of the Islamic world at the time, is weakening and facing some significant problems. And so Wahhab, he argues that the difficulties that the Islamic world is facing at this time is due to deviations from the pure faith of early Islam. Just like we hear sometimes in Christianity, right? Oh, the difficulties of the world, this is God withdrawing his protective hand over the United States or something like that. That type of argument is the same argument that he's making for the Islamic world, right? The Islamic world has fallen from the true teaching of Islam, the true teaching of Muhammad, and we need to get back to it. And that will fix the problems that we see in the Islamic world. Confucianism. So that's it for Islam, where we're going to look at religious ideas in China, right, outside of the Christian attempted Christian conversion of China. So during the Ming and the Qing dynasties, China operated within a Confucian framework, enriched now by the insights of Buddhism and Taoism. This is called Neo-Confucianism, and Neo just means a reemergence, right? A new version of Confucianism. So we might say this is a reformation, right? And we haven't talked about the dynasties in China yet this period, but we've already talked a little bit about Christian influence there, right? And this would cause those who are against Christianity to make a similar argument that we just saw with Wahhab, right? We need to return to our true Chinese roots, to Confucian teaching, to the relationships. We need to get our relationships right. We need to find that balance that Taoism seeks. And we need to do that to keep China strong, right? And so this is a Neo-Confucianism, and this emerges during the same time. That's not to say that there isn't some new thinking, right? Neo-Confucianism looks back and tries to reteach how it was hundreds of years ago. There's new teaching as well. An example, Wang Yangming, a scholar who argued that truth and moral knowledge are innate in humans. In other words, every human knows truth and knows what is moral. He argues that a virtuous life could be achieved by introspection and contemplation. They did not need the extended education, the study of the classic texts, and the constant striving for improvement that is often taught in Confucianism, right? And again, that top one about that humans innately can know truth and morality, right? This means that they don't need that education. This means that they know it internally, and it actually also kind of means that you might be able, that a truth for one person might be different than a truth for another person. This, of course, all challenges traditional Confucianism, and critics said that these ideas promoted excessive individualism. Individualism is an idea that has been foreign and usually not accepted in Chinese culture, in world history. This is a collective effort. The Middle Kingdom is a collective effort, right? And we can see that in Confucian teaching, right? It takes everyone. Yes, you may not be the king, you may be the subject to the king, but you still have a duty to do because we're working together. And if the king is not good, things fall apart. If the subjects are not good, things fall apart. So this is a collective effort. And so critics of Wang Yangming argued that his teachings, that this is kind of an internal thing, this is an individual thing, was promoting excessive individualism, and therefore is going to tear apart the fabric of Chinese society. Another example, Buddhist monks who are pure Buddhists and not open to mixing with Taoism or Confucianism. They want to make their religion more accessible to regular people. Sorry, I should rephrase that. Some Buddhist monks, those who had grown up in the tradition of not mixing, right, with other groups, and monks were known for withdrawing from society. They say, hey, we want our religion to be more accessible to regular people. So this idea of withdrawing from society is not necessary for enlightenment, right? We could do some things at home. You don't have to be in a monastery for this meditation. We can do this in society. And so this opens up Buddhism and a version of Buddhism that is much more open to people practicing it in their homes on a regular basis to be truly enlightened. You don't have to give up the world and go sit in a monastery. Caoxing, research based on evidence. This is another movement in China. This is a scientific movement, right? Critical of the unfounded speculation of traditional Confucianism. Tended to seek truth from facts. So kind of like the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution takes place in Europe. Here we have a movement in China in the late 1600s and through the 1700s of this. Emphasize the importance of verification, precision, accuracy, analysis, And this is a genuinely scientific approach to knowledge. So unlike reading and rereading Confucius writings, right? Kaozi argues, the movement argues that we need empirical evidence. We need to observe, we need to record, we need to use math, we need to use precision, we need to use verification, we need to be able to replicate something that happens. And that is how we find truth. Truth are derived from facts. An important movement in China, right? And a movement that's similar, again, to what happens about 150 years later in Europe, which we will get to in a little bit. All right, we just have 2 more slides and then we're done here. In India, in Hinduism, right? We have this by the 1500s. We have an India that is kind of divided between Muslims and Hindus. But when the Mughal Empire unites much of India, right, and the Mughals are Muslim, they take the approach to allow Hinduism and Muslims to function together. And so there are several cultural departures from Hindu India that bring in Muslims and Hindus together, and that it's okay, right, for these two to be together. They are not in mortal tension with each other. They can operate together. One form of that, right, is where Hinduism takes on a devotional form, bhakti, right, to achieve union with one of the Hindu deities through songs, prayers, dances, poetry, and rituals, things that some in the Islamic world are doing. Setting aside the caste distinctions and disregarding the rituals of the Brahmin priests, so downplaying the role of the priests and an important part of Hindu India, the caste system. This is very similar to mystical Sufi form of Islam, and Sufi was a mystical form in which they put much aside, and they said that, right, anyone can have contact with God and God will communicate with them, and it's not through reading the scriptures or through listening to an imam, right, an Islamic scholar. Rather, it is simply entering into this trance state, really, through dancing, through prayers, through poetry, through rituals, through experiencing the natural beauty of just life, and God can speak to you in that form. And so bhakti is very similar to that, and it's for Hinduism. And then lastly, Sikhism. Right, it is during this period in India in which this is the best example of Hinduism and Muslim Islamic teachings coming together. And in this case, we have the emergence of a new religion founded by Guru Nanak, right, blending elements of Hinduism and Islam together, again ignoring the caste system and the caste distinctions, and in this case actually finding a place for women and promoting equality of men and women together. And so this ends seclusion of women in at least those in India who follow this new religion. All right, so we've gone quickly through religions. A couple themes we should see, that we should note. Number one, the spread of religions increases, right, in these major universal religions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism. They encounter new challenges to their teachings. They have to adapt, they have to adjust, and there's a lot of changes that take place in all of these religions. And so we should be familiar with some changes and how some of those religions changed. All right, that's it for this lecture, and we will see you next time.